for all the reasons that progressives bought that the laptop was fake, I bought that it was fake. So then when you realize that it was real and that everything in that New York Post story on October 14th, 2020 was accurate, I started seeing stuff in the emails. The thing that really freaked me out was this thing that Aspen Institute, it's called a tabletop exercise, and it was actually a Zoom call to role play how to deal with a Russian hack and leak around Hunter Biden. This is like in June of 2020. So this is like months before months before Rudy Giuliani gets the laptop, but before Rudy Giuliani gives the laptop to New York Post. Why in the hell is Aspen Institute holding a tabletop exercise to pre-bunk? Basically, they are training or brainwashing all these journalists. And I mean, it's CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, Wikimedia Foundation, the Wikipedia folks, the networks, all of the social media companies, all coming together to be like, okay, well, if something is leaked, then we should not cover it in the way that journalists have traditionally covered it. Meanwhile, Stanford University, a few months earlier, had put out a report saying reporters should no longer follow the Pentagon Papers principle. Well, the Pentagon Papers, of course, is this famous episode. It was Steven Spielberg made a whole movie about it, where the Washington Post and New York Times published these internal Pentagon documents showing that the U.S. government was losing the war in Vietnam, right? This is Daniel Ellsberg, and he just releases it. He steals these documents. He breaks the law, steals these documents, gives them to the newspapers. The newspapers publish them. It's this kind of incredible moment in American journalism where we are like the First Amendment gives these newspapers the right to publish hacked, so-called hacked, but leaked information. And here you have Stanford University, Aspen Institute saying, oh, no. That's all. We should stop doing that. Journalists should no longer write about leaked information in that way. Instead, we should focus on the person who leaked it. So it really sent chills up my spine. It was the creepiest thing I'd ever seen. And this is, of course, you got to remember, Aspen Institute is funded by the U.S. government.
Yeah.
Stanford's funded by the U.S. government. So this is, people go, oh, well, you're just, one of the responses we've got is they go, oh, you're just talking about, content moderation by private companies. No, we're talking about U.S. government-funded organizations. You can't, if the U.S. government is censoring information, that's obviously a violation of the First Amendment. But if the U.S. government is funding somebody else to censor information, that's also a violation of the First Amendment. You can't indirectly, it's still a violation if you're funding somebody to demand censorship. So that was quite a steeplechase, but there's a lot here. I mean, it's a lot of people, a lot of institutions, a lot to unpack, and that was part of the reason I wanted to reach out and be like, I need a Joe Rogan session to just kind of go through it all.
Yeah, well, I'm very happy to provide that. Here's the question: obviously the laptop would harm the Hunter Biden laptop would harm Joe Biden, obviously, and if that story got out, who knows how many people would have voted the other way. Is this a direct result of the things that Trump said when he was in office that went against the intelligence community? Like, how did they decide? I would always assume that, the so-called deep state is essentially bipartisan, that they wouldn't necessarily side with the Democrats or the Republicans. They're really, they're just in charge of, they're supposed to be gathering information to protect the country. So how did they decide specifically to either stop information or propagate misinformation that would aid Joe Biden?
Yeah. Yes, that's exactly the right question. So, I mean, I think the thing you have to understand is that Trump was viewed by the deep state, by CIA, FBI, Pentagon,
NSA,
and all of the elites. And you're right, it's bipartisan in the sense that it's both never Trump Republicans and Democrats. What freaked them out the most about Trump is that he was threatening to pull the U.S. out of NATO. I don't think that was, I just think that was bluster. Like, that's insane. Like, and by the way, I should say, I support what we call the Western Alliance. I support providing military security for our allies in Asia and in Europe. I'm not there's parts of economic nationalism that I respect, but I don't think we should pull out of NATO. I think NATO has provided peace in the world and mostly been a good thing. It's obviously had some crazy abuses like Iraq. This whole experience has made me rethink my support for Ukraine. But I think it's important to understand that Trump terrified the deep state and the national security establishment. So did Brexit. There's a sense in which you had a guy on here named Peter Zion who wrote this book called, this really apocalyptic book about how the world is going to fall apart. And his whole argument, which I don't agree with, I think he's brilliant, but the book is, I think the argument's wrong. His whole argument is based on the idea that the United States is going to stop providing military security to our allies in Asia and Europe. It's all just based on this assumption that Trump is the beginning of the U.S. withdrawing from its traditional role since World War II. There's a bunch of people who obviously their ideology, their livelihoods, their identity, just their whole way of life is tied up with providing the United States providing this protection for Europe and Asia, and they viewed Trump as threatening that. I also think they just really hated the guy. They looked down on him. He was crude and all the things that people don't like about him.
And he spoke disparagingly about the intelligence community.
Yeah. I mean,
which is crazy.
Absolutely. He was against the war in Iraq. He was different. He was a nationalist Republican. And what's so interesting is that, if you read people like, people on the left, like Noam Chomsky and others who have been critics of U.S. or Glenn Greenwald, who are critics of, and I think Matt Taibbi, critics of U.S. government, military invasions around the world since World War II. I mean, we've overthrown many governments, right? Iran, Chile, Guatemala, and what the pattern is that these are places where nationalists, sometimes socialists, but often just nationalists who were trying to control their economies and they didn't want foreign interference, were coming to power. And the U.S. government would see that as a threat to providing, to having this liberal global order, as it's called. And so they saw Trump as an existential threat to this post-war liberal order, and they needed to, they viewed social media as the means to his power, which I think was exaggerated. So on the one hand, they saw a threat. I think they also saw an opportunity. The war on terror, we won. I mean, huge victory. I mean, it's shocking how successful it was in some ways. So you have a bunch of people that suddenly need something to do. So there's a lot of motivations there. And then you also have the guys that lost the Hillary campaign. John Podesta, he was her chair of her campaign. He runs the most powerful, progressive, frankly, propaganda organization in the world, or at least in the United States, the Center for American Progress. They were looking also for some reason, someone to blame for their own failures, for the dislikability of Hillary. And so there was just a lot of motivations to try to get control over social media platforms.